Hey everyone, welcome back. We're diving into a book today that's been on my list for a while. How Democracies Die. Have you gotten around to this one?
I have, and let me tell you, it's one of those books that feels eerily prescient, especially these days.
Right. It's like they were predicting the headlines.
Yeah.
So for our listeners, give us the quick elevator pitch. What's the core message of the book?
Well, Levitsky and Ziblatt, they argue that democracies rarely die at the hands of, a dictator and a military coup these days.
It's much more subtle than that, huh?
Way more insidious. They say it's this quiet erosion from within, often by elected leaders themselves, that we need to watch out for.
Okay, so not the dramatic Hollywood-style collapse we might picture.
Nope. They're talking about elected officials chipping away at the very system that put them in power.
That's kind of terrifying when you think about it. Is that something that's actually happening right now somewhere in the world?
Ah.
I mean, can you give an example?
Oh, absolutely. They use the example of Hugo Chavez in Venezuela, democratically elected, right? But once he was in power, he starts consolidating, going after the courts, the media, the opposition. It's like that old analogy of the frog in the slowly heating pot of water.
By the time they realize it's boiling, it's too late.
Exactly.
But it's not just a South American problem either, right? The book draws these unsettling parallels to other parts of the world, even closer to home.
Yeah, they point to some worrying trends in places like Turkey and Hungary, even echoes of 1930s Germany with the rise of Hitler.
A stark reminder that this can happen anywhere under the right, or should I say, wrong circumstances.
Exactly.
So how do we spot a potential autocrat in the making? Is there, like, a checklist?
Well, the book actually provides a really handy 4-point checklist, and this is where it gets interesting, I guess you could say.
Okay, hit me with it.
So the first red flag they point to is a rejection of those democratic rules of the game. So think like questioning election results without any real evidence or trying to undermine the peaceful transfer of power. Sounds familiar. And a little too close to home for comfort, honestly.
Right. The second warning sign is denying the legitimacy of your opponents.
Yeah.
And I don't just mean disagreeing with them, but like painting them as enemies of the people, a threat to the very fabric of the nation.
The classic us versus them tactic.
Exactly. Divide and conquer. Make people fear the other side. The third one gets a little more intense, tolerating or even encouraging political violence.
Yeah, that's a scary thought. The idea of violence as acceptable, even necessary in a democracy.
It's a slippery slope for sure. And then the fourth and final red flag is attempts to limit civil liberties, especially freedom of the press.
So control the flow of information, right?
Control the narrative. Very dangerous.
It's like a 1-2 punch. First, you turn up the heat, create that division, and then you silence anyone who tries to point out what's happening.
Precisely. Now, one of these signs on its own might be concerning, but if you see a leader exhibiting all four,
That's a problem.
yeah, serious cause for alarm. So those are the warning signs. But how have democracies traditionally kept these would-be autocrats in check? The book talks about this idea of political parties acting as gatekeepers. What does that even mean?
Right, so they're talking about how historically political parties would, put aside their own differences to filter out these dangerous candidates.
So it wasn't always about ideology.
Sometimes it was about protecting the system itself.
Huh. Interesting. They use the example of Henry Ford, right? Like back in the 1920s in the U.S., he was hugely popular, household name,
The
but
party bosses saw him as unfit for office, and they basically blocked his path to power. They were more concerned with, I guess, electability than ideology, which, in a way, ironically...
protected the system.
Yeah, exactly.
It makes you wonder if those old school backroom deals, as undemocratic as they might seem, actually served a purpose.
Right, like a necessary evil.
But it's not like we can go back to that. And besides, haven't things gotten more democratic since then? Like, wouldn't that make us less vulnerable?
You'd think so, right? That's actually one of the things they argue in the book, that some of the reforms, like primary elections, while well-intentioned, may have actually made us more vulnerable to these outsiders.
That's kind of counterintuitive, isn't it?
It is, because you'd think a more open system would be stronger. But it's like those reforms might have inadvertently removed some of the guardrails that used to keep these extreme or authoritarian figures from gaining power.
And it's not just about the formal rules either, right?
Right.
You're talking about those unwritten rules, those norms that underpin a healthy democracy. I think the book called them soft guardrails.
Yes, exactly. These norms of mutual toleration and institutional forbearance. And these, they argue, are just as important as those formal rules and institutions.
Okay, so break those down for me. What do they actually mean in practice?
So mutual toleration is basically accepting your rivals as legitimate. They're your opponents, not your enemies, even if you disagree with them vehemently.
Okay, so it's about keeping the political fight civilized, even when you disagree, recognizing that they're not out to destroy the country.
Right, exactly.
Now, what about institutional forbearance?
That's about exercising restraint in how you wield power. It's understanding that just because you can do something doesn't mean you should, you know.
Not exploiting every loophole just because it's technically within the rules.
Right. It's about playing fair, even when you don't have to.
But they argue that these norms, these soft guardrails, have been weakening for decades now, right?
Unfortunately, yes. And they trace it back to, they point to the 1990s with Newt Gingrich and his more in-your-face style of politics.
Oh, right, Gingrich. He was known for, like, really playing hardball.
Yeah.
And they're saying he actually played a role in normalizing that behavior, making it more acceptable to, like, break those unwritten rules.
Exactly. And that, combined with things like, the rise of hyper-partisan media, money in politics.
Oh, yeah. That's a whole other can of worms.
Right. It's like it created this perfect storm that's been eroding those crucial democratic norms.
So it's a vicious cycle. The more these norms are broken, the more acceptable it becomes to break them.
And the weaker our democracy gets.
Which then makes it easier for those who don't even care about democracy to exploit the system.
Right. They can get away with more.
It's a pretty bleak picture they paint.
It is. But, they're not without hope. They lay out a few potential paths forward, and some are more optimistic than others.
Okay, well, before I spiral into a pit of despair, let's talk about those potential paths. Give me some hope here. What are some ways we can combat this democratic backsliding, these authoritarian tendencies?
Well, they actually use this phrase, fateful alliances. And they talk about how these alliances happen when established political actors, they think they can control, manipulate these populist outsiders for their own gain.
It backfires.
Spectacularly. Think of it like...
riding a tiger and thinking you won't get bitten.
Exactly. And they have a few historical examples of this blowing up in people's faces.
Like what?
Well, one of the most, obvious examples they use is Adolf Hitler's rise to power in Germany. A lot of conservative politicians, they saw him as someone they could use.
To advance their own agendas.
Right. And then, well, we know how that turned out.
They unleashed a force they couldn't control.
Exactly. And it's not ancient history either. They draw parallels to Hugo Chavez's rise in Venezuela, where, again, established parties thought they could use his popularity, but he ended up dismantling the system they represented.
A cautionary tale for sure. But knowing all of this, what can we do? What action can we take? As individuals, how do we counter these trends and strengthen our democracy?
They argue that recognizing the problem like we are right now is the first step.
Okay, so we've got that going for us.
Right. You're ahead of the game just by being aware. But they highlight the importance of institutional reforms, things like strengthening campaign finance laws to reduce the influence of, wealthy donors.
Leveling the playing field.
Exactly. Making voting easier and more accessible.
So everyone has a voice.
Yes. And even looking at, combating disinformation.
Right, because that's a whole other beast we're dealing with these days.
It is, and they have a lot to say about that, too.
Okay, well, we're going to have to save that for another deep dive because we are just about out of time for today.
Sounds good.
But for our listeners, keep thinking about those questions. What can you do in your own corner of the world to be a more informed and engaged citizen? Because it sounds like that's where it all begins.
Those are just some starting points. There's a lot more to unpack there.
Right. We could do a whole other deep dive just on campaign finance reform or disinformation for that matter.
Absolutely. But the point is, it's not enough to just fix the system. We also need to empower individuals to be more engaged citizens.
Okay, so let's talk about that. What does that look like? How can we as individuals actually make a difference? They talk about a few different paths forward, right? Some more optimistic than others.
Right. And one scenario they paint is this idea of a democratic renewal. It's like maybe Trump's presidency, as messy and chaotic as it was, serves as this wake-up call.
So like a never-again moment. We almost went over the edge,
Sure.
but we pulled back, and now both sides are going to double down on Democracy, civility, all that good stuff.
Right, exactly. A recommitment to those shared values. They
Yeah.
suggest that the shock of what some people saw as like a near miss with authoritarianism,
Yeah.
it could actually galvanize a movement to strengthen those guardrails we were talking about earlier.
So campaign finance reform, electoral systems that are less vulnerable to manipulation, all of that.
Exactly. It's like, let's fix the game so it's played on a level playing field.
I like the sound of that. But, I mean, they also outline a much bleaker path, don't they? One where things get worse before they get better.
Yeah, and it's dangerous to just assume things will magically course correct, right? They caution about this possibility of what they call competitive authoritarianism.
Competitive authoritarianism. Okay, that sounds scary. Break that down for me. What does that actually look like? Paint me a picture.
So imagine a scenario where you still have elections, right? Like on the surface, it still looks like a democracy. But one party, they figured out how to systematically tilt the playing field in their favor.
So still a democracy,
And
but
what with an asterisk?
democracy light.
Exactly. And they do this through a mix of, legal and maybe not so legal tactics, voter suppression, gerrymandering, chipping away at those democratic norms. And over time, those elections, they become less and less meaningful.
Because the outcome is basically predetermined.
Right. The ruling party tightens its grip, dissent becomes risky, and you end up with this slow, steady erosion of democratic institutions and values.
It sounds terrifying, honestly, like something out of a dystopian novel, not the future of the United States. But, I mean, I guess given some of the trends we've seen, it's hard to dismiss it entirely.
And that's their point. It can happen here. And it often starts with these seemingly small compromises, concessions that people make in the name of expediency or, political gain.
It's that slippery slope idea, right? One compromise, it doesn't seem like a big deal at the time, but then it leads to another, and suddenly you're at the bottom of the hill wondering how you got there.
Precisely. And they argue that it's this slow creep into authoritarianism that makes it so difficult to combat, because by the time enough people realize the danger, it might be too late to turn back.
Okay, that's all pretty terrifying. But before I spiral into a pit of despair, let's talk about solutions. They do offer some hope, right? Like, what can we as individuals actually do to strengthen our democracy? How do we fight back against these authoritarian tendencies?
Well, they talk about this multi-pronged approach, so it's not just one thing.
Okay, good, because I need a multi-pronged approach to my anxiety right now. Give me the rundown. What's on the list?
So it involves both those institutional reforms we talked about.
Right, fixing the system.
Exactly. But also individual actions.
Okay, so give me the to-do list for saving democracy. Let's start with those institutional things. What are we talking about there?
So they talk about things like strengthening democratic norms, considering reforms that make the system more resilient.
More resilient to what?
To manipulation, right. So things like campaign finance reform. So it's not just about who has the most money.
Right, get money out of politics.
Easier said than done, but yeah. Making voting easier and more accessible so everyone has a voice. And even looking at, the electoral system itself, making it more representative, less vulnerable to, partisan gamesmanship.
Okay, so basically, overhauling the system. That sounds great in theory, but how do you actually get the people in power who benefit from the current system to agree to changes that might weaken their grip on that power?
Well, that's a great question, and it's not easy. And that's where those individual actions come in.
Okay, so what can we do? As everyday citizens, what can we do to actually make a difference?
They talk about being informed and engaged citizens.
So, stay informed about current events, read the news.
That's part of it, but it's more than that. It's about being critical of what you read, being aware of, disinformation campaigns.
Oh, yeah, that's a whole other minefield these days, right?
Yeah.
How do you even know what to believe anymore?
Exactly. It's about media literacy, being able to evaluate sources, identify bias, and there are organizations that can help you with that.
Okay, so become more media literate. Got it. What else?
Well, once you're informed, you use that knowledge. So hold your leaders accountable.
What does that look like, though? How do you actually do that?
Contact your representatives, go to town hall meetings, let them know you're paying attention, you're watching.
Make some noise.
Exactly. Don't just assume they know how you feel or what you want. And then, of course, there's your vote. And beyond that, support organizations that align with your values.
So, donate money.
Yeah, if you can. But even just your time, your energy, amplifying their message.
It's about putting your money where your mouth is, or your time, or your energy, whatever you've got.
Exactly. You know that saying, all that is necessary for the triumph of evil is that good men do nothing.
Yeah, I've heard that one.
Well, they argue that silence, in the face of, injustice or the erosion of democratic norms, it's a form of complicity.
So we've got to find our backbones, right? Find our voices, which is kind of scary. It's much easier to just kind of disengage, pretend it's not happening.
It is easier, but it's not really an option if we want to protect our democracy. And you don't have to do it alone, right? Connect with like-minded people, organizations, build coalitions.
Right, there's power in numbers.
Exactly. Find strength in those shared values, those shared goals.
And speaking of shared values, they also talk about the importance of engaging with people who hold different views, which honestly feels like a Herculean task these days. Like, how do you even have a conversation about politics anymore without it evolving into a shouting match? It really does feel like everyone's retreating to their own corners, only talking to people who already agree with them. It's like we've forgotten how to have a conversation, a real conversation, about these important issues.
And that's exactly what these authoritarian figures, these would-be autocrats, are counting on. They thrive on division, on polarization. It's how they consolidate their power.
So how do we break out of that cycle? How do we start talking to each other again? Because honestly, it feels like every conversation about politics these days just devolves into a shouting match. Nobody's listening. Everyone's just waiting for their turn to yell.
You're not wrong. It's tough. But they argue that it's more important than ever to resist that urge to retreat to our own little echo chambers.
Okay, so how do we do that? Give me some practical tips. How do we start bridging the divide when it feels like we're constantly being pushed further and further apart?
Well, they suggest starting by really listening.
Listening.
Yeah, like really listening. With an open mind, making a genuine effort to understand where the other person is coming from, even if you don't agree with them.
Okay, I can see how that's important, but it's easier said than done.
Yeah.
Especially when you feel like the other side isn't listening at all.
Oh, absolutely. It takes effort and patience and a willingness to, step outside your own bubble. But it's about remembering that the person you're talking to, they're not just a walking, talking embodiment of their political beliefs.
They're a human being with their own experiences and perspectives.
Exactly. And maybe, just maybe, if we can start seeing each other as human beings again, we can start finding that common ground.
Those shared values that can serve as a starting point for, a real conversation, productive dialogue. So what are those shared values? How do we find them amidst all the noise?
Well, they argue that most people, regardless of their political affiliation, they share some pretty fundamental values. A belief in fairness, a desire for a better future, a recognition that we're all in this together at the end of the day.
We're all on the same team, even when it doesn't feel like it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that's something worth fighting for.
It is. Well, I think that's a good place to leave it for today. A call to action for all of us to be more informed, more engaged, and more willing to listen to each other, even when it's hard. Because as Levitsky and Ziblatt so powerfully illustrate in How Democracies Die, the choices we make today, the conversations we have, the actions we take, they will determine the fate of our democracy tomorrow.
Couldn't have said better myself.
So until next time, keep those conversations going, keep those minds open, and keep fighting for the future you want to see.